Well, I hope this is working now. Sorry for the delay. There are a few technical hitches. These things happen. It's only the internet. Welcome to the February 2021 online meeting of Sydney Skeptics in the Pub. My name is Richard Saunders from the Australian Skeptics Committee, and I'm also the host and producer of the Skeptic Zone podcast. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge and pay my respects to the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, the traditional custodians of the land from which we are broadcasting. I would like to pay my respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. Now, don't forget you can subscribe to our magazine, The Skeptic, now celebrating 40 years in print. In fact, you can access most of the back issues of the magazine for free at www.skeptics.com.au. And now to tonight's speaker, Dr. Alan Blair. Dr. Blair completed a BSc BA at the University of Sydney and a PhD at MIT, and now is working at the University of New South Wales, where his research interests include self-learning for strategic games, robot navigation, language processing, modular deep learning. It sounds too good to be true. It sounds like an episode of Star Trek, doesn't it? Multitask learning, hierarchical evolution, and computational creativity. Tonight's presentation, DeepFake technology and computational creativity. Recent advancements in artificial intelligence and computer graphics are allowing computers to write stories, compose music, and create artworks of remarkable quality, and to generate videos which are so realistic that their authenticity is almost impossible to verify. This talk will summarize the history and current status of DeepFake technology and creativity and discuss the possible implications for news media, politics, art, music, TV, cinema, and society in general. And I'll put my teeth back in. You'll have the opportunity to ask questions of our guest, and you can do that via the link which you'll see on the Twitch page, and will take you to Slido, and you can put in your questions there, and we'll get to those after the talk. And if you haven't done so already, please click the follow button so you will be notified whenever we go live. But for now, please join me, and I'm sure this will be a fascinating talk, in welcoming Dr. Alan Blair.
Thank you very much, Richard, for that kind introduction. I'm actually from planet Earth. I only work in outer space. And thank you everyone for attending. If I can just share my screen. So what I would like to do today is just mainly to give you a bit of an introduction into some of the fundamental technologies that lay behind these kind of deep fake innovations, including neural networks, autoencoders, and generative adversarial networks, and also talk a little bit about computational creativity and including computer-generated art, which is another hobby of mine. And afterwards, I'd like to just make a few observations and maybe start a bit of a discussion about what kind of things are now possible and what may be possible in the future. So my mind is cast back to the year 1997. I remember getting together with an old friend of mine called Ben Simons, who works in the computer animation industry. He had just got back from a conference called SIGGRAPH. This is the annual conference of the ACM Special Interest Group on Computer Graphics. And he was saying that everyone at this conference was raving about a particular talk where these guys had sort of created fake videos where they made famous figures like John F. Kennedy say some ridiculous things, and at this conference, like, people were already at that stage starting to talk about the implications of this. Maybe someone could kidnap a politician release a video of them saying things, and it eventually may be hard for anyone to tell whether the video is real or not. And this, by the standards of today, this technology was kind of maybe old-fashioned, but they would get some audio and split it up into phonemes, and they would take groups of 3 phonemes, and then the middle phoneme would be turned into a what's called a viseme, the shape of the lips, and then they would try to kind of put the shape of the lips over the person's mouth and use some techniques to adjust it for the shape of the head and the tilt of the head and things like this. Now, a similar technique, or what's often used in the movie industry, is called face swapping or facial animation. So this is where you try to take the facial expression of one person and combine it with the identity of another person to get a composite image. And if you look, these images are from a TV show from 2006. The TV show was called The Plot to Assassinate Hitler, but they tried to make videos not only of Hitler but other historical figures as well. And this is kind of how they went about it. So first they would make a plaster cast of the face of the actor, and then they would sculpt the face of the historical figure over the top of that cast. And then before the actor made the performance, they would literally paint colored dots onto the person's face. And so they would kind of register where these dots are on the face and where they correspond on the cast and then on the sculpture, and the person would deliver their performance. And then you have software which would track the motion of all these dots and try to recreate the same motions on the created face and put it together with some rendering and so on. And I think in this case they then tried to post-process the film to make it look old and historical. And this technique has been used in a number of different movies. I think it kind of maybe started with Gollum with the Lord of the Rings movies, and then you have Caesar in the Planet of the Apes and this movie Avatar. And it's a bit hard to see in these images, but these people also have dots on their faces, and sometimes it's combined with motion capture that detects the tilt of the head and even the pose of the body. So you can have kind of the motion of the face and the motion of the body. Now, we fast forward to 2018. This is where neural networks started to be used into the process. And so you have this sort of famously fake video of President Obama. So what I'd like to do now is just give you a brief introduction to neural networks. So this is what a biological neuron looks like in your brain. It's a kind of a brain cell, and it has these structures called dendrites, and these can carry electrical signals from other neurons, and those electrical signals change the voltage inside the cell. They can either increase the voltage or decrease the voltage depending on whether the connection is excitatory or inhibitory. And if the voltage in the cell ever gets above a certain threshold, then we say that the neuron fires and an electrical signal goes along this axon, and then then those signals can be carried to other neurons, and that may cause other neurons to fire. So you get a kind of chain reaction. Now, in 1940, the real biology of all this is very complicated with lots of chemistry and so on. But in 1943, these guys, McCulloch and Pitts, tried to come up with a very simple mathematical model of a neuron. And what they came up with is this. this. They say, well, we have a bunch of inputs, x1 up to xn, and each input gets multiplied by some weight, which could be positive or negative. All of that is summed together, and if the combined value, this combined value represents the voltage, if you like, inside this artificial neuron, and if the voltage exceeds a certain threshold, then the network outputs a value of 1, and otherwise it outputs a value of 0. So it's kind of the simplest possible model that tries to capture the essence of these neurons. And Frank Rosenblatt in 1957, he figured out a way to try to get one of these artificial neurons to learn a task. So one of the tasks he was interested in was character recognition. You see, this is the days before transistors. His computer consisted of vacuum tubes and so on. But he takes a camera, he takes an image, he takes a picture of a character that's 20 by 20 resolution that gives him 400 numbers. He feeds the 400 numbers into one of these artificial neurons, and the neuron tries to tell whether the recognize a character. So this is an early example of machine learning. Now, a model of one neuron, of course, is very limited in its functionality. It can only implement a function that's called linearly separable. But then in the 1980s and 90s, people figured out ways to put these artificial neurons together into a network. And then you can kind of get this network to learn some tasks. They needed a few tricks here. They needed to replace that step function with a continuous activation function and a few other things, but you can train it by a method called gradient descent. And there was a lot of activity in the 90s. These networks were, it wasn't yet what we call deep learning. It's more like shallow learning, but they were able to do certain tasks like credit card fraud detection and various other things. Now, the era of deep learning and deep neural networks really begins in about 2012, and the catalyst for it, in one sense, was this image classification competition. So by this stage, it's not the 1950s anymore. People are getting beyond character recognition, and they want to classify other images. So there was this competition where you had 1.2 million images in 1,000 different categories, and you had to try to predict which category images belong to. And people tried various methods for this. They tried traditional image processing techniques and support vector machines and various other things. They were getting about 6, 7, 8% accuracy, and then suddenly this group from Jeff Hinton's lab at University of Toronto managed to jump up from 8% accuracy to 15% accuracy. And if if there's 1,000 different categories and 15% of the time you're getting the correct category out of those 1,000, that's actually very good performance. So this was done with a neural network, and these networks were also inspired by the brain in a sense. So these classic studies that were done by Hubel and Wiesel in the 1950s about the primary visual cortex. So they figured out that there are some neurons that only fire when they see a line in the image at a particular angle. And then if you go into deeper layers, you may see a neuron that will fire if you have a line at a particular angle moving in a particular direction. And further in, you get things that respond to more and more sophisticated shapes. So inspired by this, Jan LeCun came up with this concept of a convolutional neural network. So the idea here is as follows: like, you want to classify this image as being a boat or a bird or a truck or something. If you can see a certain kind of feature in one part of the image, then if it's useful in one part of the image, the same feature very likely will be useful in another part of the image. So these neurons are arranged in a two-dimensional array, and a particular neuron here will calculate its activation based on this small part of the image, and then some other neuron elsewhere will calculate its activation using the same weights effectively from another part of the image. So you get this information that's kind of spatially segregated, and for historical reasons, these things are called filters. Yeah, so we've got 3 filters here. And as you go through, you could have like multiple layers in these networks. And as you go through the network, the geometry of these filters shrinks. So if the original image is, for example, 32 by 32 pixels, this layer might be 28 by 28, but then the next layer might be 14 by 14, and this might be 6 by 6. And there's various methods used to shrink the thing down, either by downsampling or strided convolutions. And so as you move through the network, you get the information becomes less and less spatially located, and eventually you get to these sort of 1 by 1 units. And at that point, which are fully connected, and these units carry information that are completely spatially diverse. Yeah, so these convolutional networks. And this is kind of a simple version from 1998. When you get to this is the net that actually won that competition in 2012. It was a significant engineering feat. They needed to use two computer chips hooked together because one chip wasn't powerful enough, and etc. And there's multiple. Okay, and if you actually look at what these convolutional layers are computing, the first layer, the neurons in the first layer are actually very reminiscent of what was found in what Hubel and Wiesel found in their studies. So, for example, this filter here would respond to a line in this particular direction. And these are also, if you're familiar with image processing, these are also similar to what are called Gabor filters. But then when we move to the deeper layers, we see neurons that respond to more sophisticated shapes. I think this network was trained on possibly on a database of motor cars. So that's why you see things that look like wheels and hubcaps and so on. And then people figured out that these networks, if you follow the process in reverse, you can use this to actually create an image. So here you start out with 100 random numbers or 100 numbers, and you go through convolutional layers which increase in size, and eventually what ends up here is actually an image. And so you've got a neural network that can create an image and a neural network that can classify an image. Well, it's a good idea to stick them together. Now, there's 2 different ways to stick them together. So the first thing that people tried is what's called an autoencoder. So this is just kind of a schematic, but these are meant to be this is meant to represent these deep convolutional networks. So this thing here, this top thing here is meant to be what I just showed you, that creates an image. So it takes some numbers and turns it into an image. And then this thing here is an encoder. It takes an image and turns it into numbers. And you try to train this thing so that it can reproduce the original image. So, you feed an image here, it gets converted into numbers, it gets converted back into an image. You want this image to be as close as possible to this image. And after the idea here is after after you've trained it, you can perhaps discard this encoder and just use the decoder, and you can feed some random numbers in here, and it should create a fake image, right? But one that will look realistic. So these are some images created by an autoencoder. So none of these people really exist. These are like fake people generated from random numbers. But one thing you'll see, the images are pretty good, but the quality isn't fantastic. You know, you could see they're a little bit blurry, especially the background. And so then people said, well, yeah, this is nice, but we'd like to have a way to make better quality images. And they ended up using what are called generative adversarial networks. So in order to lead up to generative adversarial networks, I want to take a little bit of a detour into something that's called artist-critic coevolution, because it kind of, this is the framework that it fits into. So this is one method that's used for computer-generated art, is that you have a system that generates images and have something, a neural network or something that looks at those images. So you have an artist and you have a critic, and the idea here is that the critic, you also have a set of real images, and the critic is trying to tell the difference between the real images and the generated images. But the artist is trying to generate images that the critic will think are real. So if the critic, the first person who really emphasized the role of the critic in the artistic process was Marcel Duchamp. He called it the spectator, and he described how the creative act is really kind of an interaction between the artist and the spectator. Now, when we get to kind of computer-generated art, in the early days, a human always played the role of the critic. So in 1986, you have this kind of blind watchmaker paradigm where a system generates 15 images and they appear on the screen. The human clicks on the ones they like, and then in the next generation, new images are created which are slight modifications of the ones that were selected. So this is called like interactive evolution. In the beginning, the images were pretty simple, but as computer technology improved, you get gradually more and more sophisticated images. And it's interesting, like different image generating paradigms give you a different kind of style of image, but still the human had to be in the loop. You know, to produce an image, this is from PicBreeder, to produce an image of this quality, you might have to go through 50 different generations. It's a bit time consuming. So people have said, well, can we replace the human with an automated critic? And the first attempts to do this were pretty hokey because the critic was very simple. It was just one of these old-fashioned two-layer neural networks. But then in 2014, Ian Goodfellow had the idea to have a convolutional neural network play the role of both the artist and the critic. So we just remind ourselves, you know, how a neural network can generate the image and what this is. So the artist, which he called a generator, takes some 100 numbers and turns them into an image. The critic is one of these classification networks, so it takes the image and it produces a number, and the critic produces a number between 0 and 1, and it tries to produce a number close to 1 if the image is real, and close to 0 if the image is fake. So it's trying to guess whether the image is real or fake. So the critic is trying to classify the images accurately. So the critic is trying to produce a number close to 1 for these images and a number close to 0 for these images. The artist is trying to produce images for which the critic will assign a number close to 1, because the artist is trying to fool the critic. And the clever thing about GANs is that the training signal is somehow back propagated through the image and into the artist. Now, I apologize for the equation, but this is really necessary in order to understand how these GANs work. So you've got this expression here, which the discriminator is trying to maximize and the generator is trying to minimize. So if the discriminator is given a real image, it's trying to produce a number close to 1. It's trying to produce as large a number as it can. And so if this number is large, then log of it will also be large. So the discriminator is trying to maximize this. Now, if the discriminator is given a generated image, it wants to produce a number as close as possible to 0. So it wants this number to be as low as possible. So 1 minus that should be as high as possible. So the discriminator is trying to maximize this combination. Now, meanwhile, what about the generator? Well, the generator can't do anything about this because that's to do with the real images, but the generator is trying to produce images that the discriminator will give a number close to 1. So the generator is trying to make this number as high as possible, which means 1 minus it will be as low as possible. So you get this kind of tension between the generator and the discriminator. The discriminator is trying to maximize this and the generator is trying to minimize it. And that's really it's that tension that is the essence of these GANs. And these are examples of images that are produced by these GANs. So again, these people are also fake. They don't exist, but you can see they look much more realistic than the previous images. And GANs, there's a great variety of different types of GAN and different uses. You can use them to generate not only faces, but also images of bedrooms or other things. This is another example of a special kind of GAN. This is called a variance on the GAN. This is called a conditional GAN. So here, like, you specify that certain parts of the image have to fit into certain categories. This has to be water and this has to be clouds and so on, and it generates an image for you. So why is it that these images are so good? Well, the thing you've got to realize is that these deep networks are easily fooled. So if you take one of these networks that won this image classification competition years ago, they are actually classifying new images very well. But if you know the structure of the network, you can fool it. You can take an image that's correctly classified, and then you can add some noise to that image that's very carefully constructed, and a human won't notice any difference, but somehow the network suddenly is convinced that this is an image of an ostrich. This one here, the dog does actually look a little bit like an ostrich, but these other ones, we're kind of at a loss to figure out why this would be an ostrich. So, and the reasons for this are still being debated. It's partly due to the number of parameters in the network being so large and so on. But really, this is the key point about these GANs. So if you were to train the discriminator first and then afterwards and fix it, and then afterwards train the generator would figure out ways to exploit weaknesses in the discriminator. But because you're training both of them at the same time, you get this kind of coevolutionary dynamics that the generator will learn to exploit weaknesses in the discriminator, but then the discriminator has a chance to learn to correct those weaknesses, and then the generator has to look for other weaknesses and so on. So you get this kind of continual arms race, and that's really what gives the GAN its edge, as opposed to like an autoencoder. And so what distinguishes these deepfakes is that they all use this kind of technology in one way or another. So it is actually possible, if you think about this face swapping task, it's actually possible to do the entire task only with a neural network. You don't get a fantastic result, but you get a reasonable result. So basically what it involves is that you try to segregate out the hidden units. You try to make it so that some of the hidden units learn the identity of the person and the other hidden units learn the facial expression. And then if you combine hidden units coming from different images, then you can get this kind of morphing going on. So it's possible to do the whole job with neural networks, but if you want, the trick is to combine it. So in this case, the neural network is used to decide basically the shape of these reference points around the mouth. And then after that, traditional graphic techniques are used to do the rendering. Yeah, so you can, so to get the best results, you have to combine neural networks with graphical methods, but all of these modern methods use neural networks in one capacity or another, which is why they're called deep fakes. Okay, so now I'd just like to take a little kind of foray into computer-generated art. It is possible to use GANs to generate art. So these three works are by Robbie Barrett. This is by a French group who kind of cloned Robbie Barrett's code. In order to do this, you need a big database of existing artworks. You need a few thousand artworks, and then you try to train the network to produce new artworks in a similar style. There are other ways to generate art. This is another method called neural style transfer. What happens here is you start with a photograph and a painting. So in this case, this is a photograph of me hiking in Matera in northern Greece a couple of years ago. This is a famous painting by Van Gogh. And you can train a neural, I was just amazed when I first saw this, but you can train a neural network to combine the content of one image with the style of another image, and you really get quite a remarkable result. Yeah, this really does look like a painting. And this is just some work of mine. This is within the context of artist-critic coevolution, but in this case, this critic is a convolutional neural network, but the artist in this case is like a genetic program. And so these are 21 kind of stylized versions of the Eiffel Tower. And these are some other artworks that I've created with the same method. Yeah, you can look at this website if you want to see, interested to see more images. Okay, so now I'd like to move on to a discussion of, the implications of all this. So first, let's talk about fake news. Yeah, these concerns that people had in 1997 about politicians being kidnapped and so on how have they come to pass? Well, the first thing you got to realize is that fake news is not a new thing. These are just a few examples I pulled off Wikipedia. So this is allegedly a photograph of Ulysses S. Grant at City Point, but in fact, the head of Grant's head has been stuck on top of somebody else's body, and the rider and the horse have been stuck on top of a different background. So the whole thing is really fake. So this kind of manipulation goes back almost as old as photography itself. This is another famous example of a manipulated photograph. The Cottingley fairies. I mean, again, this is quite remarkable. I mean, when we look at this, it's really quite obvious to us that this photograph is faked. It's a kind of double exposure, and yet people as prominent as Arthur Conan Doyle were really taken in by this and insisted that this was a real photograph. Yeah. And then, you know, who can forget the famous tourist guy from 1997? This photograph was really taken in the winter of 1997, but then later the plane was added to make it look as if it was it happened at the time of the September 11 attacks. So fakery is nothing new. Sometimes we are able to, if you've got a keen eye, sometimes you can spot a fake. So I'm reminded of the Beijing Olympics in 2008, which I watched. You know, I was watching the opening ceremony on TV with my family, and when it got to the fireworks, I became a little bit suspicious. I mean, they just looked a little bit too perfect somehow. And, you know, especially the way it's reflected in the water. I mean, you can't, I have had the privilege of being in Beijing when the weather was this clear, but it's very rare. And so I kind of looked at this and I thought, you know, really, I don't think this is real. I think this is a computer simulation. And it turned out it really was a computer simulation, or at least it has widely been reported to be a computer simulation. Sometimes you don't know whether the fakeness is really fake itself. But this also raises other interesting issues. I mean, there were other things that were claimed to be fake in relation to the Beijing Olympics. Like, for example, they got one girl to sing, they got one girl to pretend to sing to a recording of another girl, and they got heavily criticized for this. But then it turned out people started to look back at like the 2000 Olympics in Sydney, and it turned out like a lot of things were faked there. You know, they actually at one point they had the Sydney Symphony Orchestra pretending to play a piece of music that had actually been pre-recorded by the Melbourne Symphony Orchestra. So this sort of thing happened in 2000, but somehow no one really complained about it. No one really cared. There wasn't any social media in those days. So there is this weird kind of evolution going on that on the one hand, it's becoming easier to make videos that look more realistic, but there's also this whole infrastructure of people questioning things and questioning whether they're fake and challenging them. So yeah, there's sort of this interesting coevolution going on. And also, if you look at some of the videos from the 2020 presidential election, yeah, the most prominent ones were not using these sophisticated deep learning, but actually pretty simple techniques. So, for example, they would alter a video to make it look as if Biden was in a different state. to make it look as if he was confused and saying the wrong state, or they'd take a video of Trump and mess around with the audio. So a lot of the most famous fake videos actually were using techniques that aren't really that sophisticated. I might also say, this, just going back to the September 11, I have to say, when I watched the September 11 attacks live on TV, it did also occur to me that that might be faked. But then when I saw the building collapse, that was when I knew it wasn't faked, because the technology at that time was not sophisticated to make that look realistic. Now, what about implications for the movie industry? Well, this is a movie. This is Back to the Future 2 from 1989. This is This one is from the original movie, the original Back to the Future, and Crispin Glover played the role of George McFly. He did a really good job, but apparently he argued with the filmmakers, particularly about the last scene. In the original version of the last scene, the McFly family are shown as being very wealthy, and they're living in a mansion, and they've got servants and fancy food and all this. And Chris Glover quite rightly complained about that. He said, well, you know, the emphasis of the film really should be on personal growth and self-actualization rather than on the money. I think he went so far as to say, well, you know, if the main reason for Marty McFly to go back in time was to make his parents rich, he could have just like robbed a bank and then escaped in his time machine before the police caught him. It would have been a lot simpler, you know. So the filmmakers took on board his criticisms and changed the last scene, but somehow they kind of treated him with a bit of suspicion after that. You know, they were a bit annoyed that this young upstart had dared to challenge them. We don't really know what exactly went on behind the scenes, but somehow he wasn't in the next movie. It's not unusual to replace an actor in a movie. But what is unusual is the lengths that they went to try to make it look as if Crispin Glover was still in this movie. They had made a plaster mold of his face for the original movie just for the convenience of the makeup artists. And so they kind of dug that mold out from a warehouse somewhere and used it to make a mask. And they got Jeffrey Weissman to wear that mask. I'm a bit surprised at how bad this is. Like, if you look closely, I think you can see that he's actually wearing a prosthetic. So Crispin Glover wasn't happy about this. He sued the studio. There was a big legal case. And after this, the Screen Actors Guild inserted a new clause into its standard contract, which said that in future, you weren't allowed to do this kind of thing without the permission of the actors. So then we go forward to Princess Leia. Now, there was a rumor going around that that CGI of Princess Leia was created after Carrie Fisher died. That rumor wasn't actually true. The footage of Princess Leia in the final movie was actually filmed preemptively during her lifetime. But what they did do for The Force Awakens is that they created fake footage of the young Princess Leia. They found another actress who had a similar bone structure, and again, the same kind of motion capture we talked about before with the dots on the face and so on. So you think about this, where's this all going? I mean, it's been used to recreate historical figures from the past. here it's being used to create a young version of someone who's still alive. There was a rumor going around last year that some studio was wanting to make a new film starring James Dean. So the idea was that this film would star James Dean and his character would be completely created by CGI. And James Dean's family didn't object. They said they were happy for the movie to be made, but the Screen Actors Guild weren't happy about it. And yeah, I don't know what the current status is, but the last I heard, that movie was kind of on hold. But you see the issues that this raises. Like, I guess you can kind of see why the Screen Actors Guild is worried, because if you can make new movies starring James Dean or Elvis Presley or Marilyn Monroe or Groucho Marx or whoever, there is a risk that just like what happened to the journalism industry, the photography industry, and many other professions, it's not that acting would disappear altogether, but it would lose its, it would become less lucrative and less prestigious than it currently is. And I mean, one of the things that's at the moment, the voice synthesis is not very good. It's nowhere near as good as a human. So at least for the foreseeable future, you have to get a human to do the voice, really. But that may change one day. And it's worth pointing out that there are actually completely virtual celebrities. So this is Hatsune Miku. I mean, this is serious. You know, this is like a virtual performer. And if you look on YouTube, you'll see footage of these, thousands of people show up at these concerts, and she appears as like a holographic image, singing and dancing. And so, yeah, again, in future, you may have like virtual movie stars, people that never really existed at all. Who knows? And there's also this phenomenon of virtual girlfriend apps, which, this is kind of a bit weird too. I mean, from what I hear, these most of these virtual girlfriend apps do maintain some level of decorum, to the extent that, like, you cannot get the character to be. You can get the character to wear lingerie and perhaps a swimsuit, but normally you can't get them to be fully naked. But of course, these deep fakes are all used in the porn industry, which is a whole other story. So what about, so where is all this heading? I think it's worth pointing out the extent to which this technology is making things cheaper as well as more realistic. So there was a shot, if you go back to this Titanic movie in 1997, there was a shot in that movie that was called the $1 million shot, because it cost $1 million to make it. It's like it starts at the front of the ship, and kind of the camera kind of sweeps around, pans over the whole ship. And I didn't when I first saw this, I thought this was an Australian flag. It actually isn't. It's called a UK blue ensign. Anyway, it's been estimated, if you were to recreate this shot today, it wouldn't be the $1 million shot. It would be perhaps the $40,000 shot, which is still a lot of money, but a lot less than $1 million. I mentioned before the movie Avatar. I mean, James Cameron basically sat on the script of Avatar for 10 years, waiting for the technology to become good enough. for that movie to be made. And just one more example, this Watchmen movie, the comic came out in the late 1980s, but it wasn't made into a movie until 2009 for various reasons. But I think one of the key reasons was that they were waiting for the technology so that some of these scenes, like the one on Mars, could be done in a reasonable cost and still look good. So you get this advancing technology. And then at the other end of the spectrum, of course, you get these apps like GoAnimate and Extra Normal and Plotagon, where people sitting in their own living room can just kind of make their own little animations. That technology is also advancing. And so, yeah, you got this whole spectrum. You got big budget movies that are becoming more realistic. You've got perhaps low budget movies that are able to do things they couldn't previously do. And then you've got like that totally amateur level. Whether these amateur movies will ever become, as good as what's currently professional, it's hard to say. But I just mentioned, one of the things you bump into is what's called the uncanny valley. So this is this is Professor Ishiguro of Osaka University with a robot copy that he made of himself. And the term goes back to the 1970s. So what this refers to is that in general, more realistic is better, but there is this kind of gap where things become so realistic that they become a bit kind of disturbing. We kind of look at them and we feel as if it's like a real person, but then something has gone wrong to them. And we're discomforted by that, and we actually prefer something that's not quite as realistic. Yeah, so there's this kind of barrier. Again, like especially at the amateur end of the spectrum, we don't know whether things will ever really cross that uncanny valley, or whether they'll stay a bit unrealistic. I mean, there was a lot of discussion years ago. There was a lot of discussion about the comparison between Shrek and Final Fantasy. Like Final Fantasy was more realistic, but Shrek was a much more popular movie. And then, then there's the question that naturally arises: will we ever get to the point where the making of a movie can be fully automated? You just specify that you want to see a movie in which, with Cary Grant and Keira Knightley set in Mongolia, and a romantic comedy with, you specify some parameters and then you press a button and the movie gets generated for you automatically. I mean, will we ever get to that stage? Well, I'm not sure, but might just briefly mention a lot of what would go into a movie falls into the area of what's called procedural content generation. So this is any kind of, it's usually for computer games rather than movies, but the same techniques can be adapted to movies. It could be generating stories, generating characters, generating scenery. In this case, this is just one example. This is from a competition that was organized in 2019 by Christoph Salga. In this case, the competition was as follows. You had to write a program which, given, if it was given terrain in Minecraft, the terrain is given, and then the program has to create a settlement. So it has to create these bridges and houses and so on. And this is this in itself is quite a significant challenge, because there's a trade-off if you just stick with simple buildings and a few different, only a few, all buildings looking the same. The result might look pretty boring. But if you expand out and allow a lot of variety, you get the risk that you could have doorways going nowhere, or roofs that overhang, or bridges that don't end properly, and so on. Like all these little interfaces between the bridge and the balcony and so on have to look proper, but while still maintaining variety. So I mean, I'm just showing you this just for this one aspect of content generation, to generate the buildings in which the action will take place, already poses significant challenges. And then what about automatically generating a story? Well, this is interesting too. So traditionally, again, you think about this in comparison to the image processing. People had traditional methods, and then they brought in neural networks. The same sort of thing with text generation and chatbots. There were traditional methods which were hidden Markov models and rule-based systems and so on. Now, there was an incident a couple of years ago where Microsoft tried to, I should say, for many language processing tasks, neural networks have already taken over. Language translation, for example, is all done by neural networks now. But in terms of chatbots, Microsoft a couple of years ago tried to make this chatbot and that would learn from interacting with people on the internet, and unfortunately it started coming out with things that were very rude and very racist. And for that reason, for the chatbots, even the big companies like Google and Facebook still are using the old-fashioned rule-based systems because it's easier to control. But the neural network technology is now getting so good that eventually they may have to switch over and possibly control the rudeness in some other way. So this GPT-3 system was released last year by OpenAI. They demonstrate a lot of different tasks, but at the end of their paper, they show this task where the system is asked to generate a fake news item with a particular title and subtitle. Afterwards, someone analyzed this and sort of did a Google search for this title and subtitle, and they found that they found two existing articles with this topic or a very similar topic, and the article that GPT-3 produced is in some sense a mashup between the two existing ones. So it's not a mashup in the sense of just a few words from one and then a few words from the other. It's a mashup they're combined at a deeper level. But it does raise questions about to what extent this is really doing something novel. Is it just remembering things and then mashing them together? It also raises questions about, but the existence of this kind of system does raise questions about authorship and copyright, because you could use this system or something very like it to generate a new essay on the Spanish Civil War or whatever, and it would. Well, this is the thing. If if there are only two existing essays on this topic, it'll merge those two. But if there are 20 existing essays, it'll merge all 20. And the similarity with any one of those is going to be quite small. So these systems like Turnitin that try to look for plagiarism when people submit essays, realistically, those days might be numbered. And just this is my final slide. OpenAI, well, this is hot off the press, 2021. They got something that converts text to images. So again, these are both using something called a transformer. It's a special kind of neural network with lots and lots of parameters. So in this case, they asked the system to generate an image of an illustration of a baby daikon radish and a tutu walking a dog, and this is what it comes up with. These images, it's asked to produce a stained glass window in the shape of a strawberry. So, yeah, at the moment, these are just little tiny vignettes. It's not like a whole movie, but this is technology that may push further ahead in the future too. Okay, so yeah, I hope that's raised some issues for you, and thank you for your attention, and I'd be happy to take any questions.
Well, thank you very much. What a fascinating talk. I was sitting here as well as the viewers, because we've had lots of questions flowing in, but maybe the first one, I'll take the privilege of maybe making the first point. The Cottsley fairies, the one with the little girl and the little fairies from almost a century ago, that was actually a little cardboard cutout stuck into the ground. And James Randi investigated this, and he discovered that one of the giveaways was that it would have a long exposure. So if you look at the waterfall in the background, you can see the motion in the waterfall, yet the foreground is perfectly still. But of course, these days we look at that and we see cardboard cutout fairies, and we wonder how on earth anybody could be fooled by that. It's quite extraordinary. Right, I say questions coming in. The very first question, what it says, are you real, or have we been watching a virtual?
Well, actually, it's interesting you ask that. So when GPT-3 first came out, well, there's a philosopher of mind based today in you called David Chalmers. When GPT-3 first came out, someone posted online allegedly an interview with David Chalmers about GPT-3, but it turned out that it was fake, and the responses from Dave actually were generated by GPT-3. But there was some discussion about this on Facebook, and yeah, a couple of people said they were fooled. One person said they thought it was Dave, but maybe he was a bit hungover from a bit drunk or something. And there was a couple of similar things. There was fake interviews with a couple of other philosophers, but if you look at this text carefully, the responses do contain like key phrases from that person's book or so. So there was sort of a little bit sort of weird. In a way, they're sort of taking things that were, I guess it makes sense, but it takes things that were written by that person and mashing them in there somehow. Yeah.
Wow. I say other questions coming in. Somebody asked, which is a very good question for a skeptical audience. Are people using this now to make realistic UFO photos and videos? I think that's been happening for a while.
I haven't heard of deep fakes being used for that purpose, but it could be done. Yeah,
could be done. I mean, you could hardly tell the real aliens from the fake ones in those. How would you know if it's a real alien or a fake alien? Another question coming in. Have we or will we come to the point of simply not knowing which is real and which is fake? Simply having no hope of distinguishing between the two?
Look, it's a good question. I mean, I don't know. Other people may be able to answer that better than me. I mean, it's partly, I guess, but it's partly to do with the technology. and partly to do with the whole ecosystem. Like, how will it, like, if people saw something and thought that it was fake, would they go and try to look on Snopes.com or something, you know, to try to verify it? Or would they just believe it? You know, so how people react would have a influence over this. But if those services kind of break down, we could be flung into that world. I guess I mean, it's interesting. Like you go and visit. You go to Athens and you visit those old museums, and people try to explain to you, oh, like in the ancient world or the pre-modern world, people didn't try to distinguish between truth and myth the same way we do. I wonder whether in the future people visiting a museum will be told, well, there was this brief period in the late 20th century when people actually did try to distinguish truth from fiction. But then we reverted to the old way.
Well, why would you bother anymore? Yeah. Another question's coming in by one of our audience tonight, and thank you everybody for enjoying this evening. The questioner says, how long until a world leader dies and the state keeps it a secret using deep fakes to keep people in the dark? Maybe it's happened already. I don't know.
Yeah, it could have.
Well, I mean, you alluded, you had the example of Barack Obama. Now, I remember when I was seeing those things first up, I was mightily impressed, quite astounded. But upon re-looking at them, I'm not so impressed anymore, I must say.
That is interesting. So you think you've adapted and you can
well, you know, it's. I guess I'm not being fair because, well, I knew it was fake to begin with, but when I saw it, I thought that's incredible. So looking back on it now, I guess I'd have to put myself to a test and see two next to each other and try to decide which one was the fake. But I guess it's possible that some world leader would die and that the ruling party would prop him up on TV or his generated facsimile.
I mean, I think, well, if you think about North Korea could probably get away with this. I mean, there are stories about when Stalin died, it took like days for people to, I've heard it described that like it was like, you know, Russian dolls or something. Like the first inner circle were told, first was the inner circle and then the slightly outer circle, and then at each stage, the next group of people just refused to believe that it was true, and it took them like a day or two to accept it, and then they would try to tell the next group of people, and the same thing would be repeated.
Yes. Well, fake news is nothing new, as you said. Another comment is coming in with the yes. Now with people like Peter Cushing, who was somehow brought back to life for one of the Star Wars movie, and I thought that was impressive. Yet, not long afterwards, people in the wider computing community took it upon themselves to improve what the huge budget studios had done, and by and large did a better job. Is that simply because the technology is progressing at such an astounding rate that, I don't want to use the word amateurs, but people in smaller businesses or the dedicated amateur can reproduce these things?
Oh, I would say that's probably true. I mean, this is the problem. You know, it's interesting if you go back and look at movies like Titanic still holds up pretty well, but if you look at movies like The Abyss or Alexander, well, I'm old enough to remember. I shouldn't admit this, but I'm old enough to remember Superman, the movie. You know, when that came out, we thought that was fantastic, but you look at it now and it looks absolutely terrible. Yeah, the same thing. Yeah, movies from around about 2000, Alexander and The Abyss, they look pretty terrible now. And so, and I think one of the Star Wars movies, is it? I think there's an animated Star Wars movie. I think it's called I forget what it's called, the Clone Wars or something. Like it's episode 4.5 or something. It's not part of the. I mean, again, it looks pretty dreadful. So, I mean, this is the problem that you face as a filmmaker, I guess, that you might be harshly judged.
Yeah.
Too many years in the future, which is what I guess that's like, again, it comes to this uncanny valley thing. Like Shrek will probably never age because they didn't try to make it look realistic to begin with.
Right. I take your point about Superman because I was however old I was when I went to see it, and it was in the cinemas, and it was just mind-blowing. It was incredible, you know. But you're right. In viewing now, you view a movie like Superman, which is a great movie, which is a fantastic story and really fun, but you can't help but notice the limitations of their technology in the day. And I wonder now if in 20 or 30 years people look at productions now and go, oh, you know, they tried. We shall see. We shall see. I think we've got time for one more question. Let's see what's come in. A question about you were talking earlier, and you talk about generations of improvement, and a computer will do a generation, another generation, and so on, sort of harking back to the old evolution things. But with the increased computing power, these generations must, what are they, seconds? Are they microseconds? Are they minutes before it can generate a new generation?
Well, okay. Well, if there's a human in the loop, then the pace is set by the human, I guess. However long that, you know, the human will come back in a few seconds with the next set of images. To be honest, yeah, with my computer-generated art, a generation may take a few minutes. So it just kind of ticks away in the background and produces an image every few minutes. But because it's fully automated, you don't worry too much. There's a lot of different. There's another fully automated system called Electric Sheep, which generates like videos and so on. And yeah, that would take a few minutes probably for each generation too. But yeah, it may get faster in the future, like everything.
I imagine it would. You set the computer going, go to bed, and by the time you've woken up, there's a whole new civilization being generated at astonishing speeds. Now, that would make an interesting movie. All right. Well, listen, thank you very much for a fascinating talk, a bit of a glimpse into the past and possibly the future. I think sometimes I'm computer generated, but I'll leave that up to the audience to decide. And to the wider audience, thank you very much, everybody, for joining us tonight at Sydney Skeptics in the Pub. We are optimistic that within a relatively short amount of time, we might be able to meet once again in person at the real Skeptics in the Pub. But there are plans underway that if we do that, to keep some sort of online presence and maybe broadcasting our talks as we all enjoy our meetings and are able to see each other once again. A big thank you to Lara Benham, who's been behind the scenes tonight, making sure that I come up and other people come up and this happens and those wires are all put together. And without Lara's tireless efforts in learning the software and being there, this event simply wouldn't continue. Once again, you can join the Skeptics fun and games by going to www.skeptics.com.au, see what we're up to, learn about more events, download all the back issues of our magazine for free, read those at your leisure, or you can sign up and get the new copies of the magazine 4 times a year. But for tonight, until we see you again at the next Skeptics in the Pub, this is Richard Saunders signing off from Sydney, Australia.